So what I'd like to do is just give you some updates as accountability of some of the work that we've done so far. Can you confirm that screen is visible?
Confirmed.
Awesome, great. So we did launch with the motto, One Caribbean, One Fight. And over the past 6 months or so, we've taken a closer look at the structure and decided to simplify it a bit. We did have a convener's role that was part of the initial structure. And that, of course, has been simplified in the sense of removing that role and putting more emphasis on the training committee. So we have the leadership committee, the secretariat, which is being done by Free the Slaves, and our 5 committees. The Survivor Committee has been renamed to Survivor Advocacy and Engagement Committee. The Membership Committee, Advocacy, Research and Training Committees remain the same. We've also added a wonderful new person to our leadership committee, and that is in the form of Shamir McKenzie, who is joining us on the call today. And as I mentioned, Honor Tip from Jamaica has accepted to be the chair of the leadership committee. So they took up that role in January of this year. The year is running ahead of me already. So they took up that role in January. So we still have the same 5 initial projects that we'll be starting with. Our regional stakeholder mapping is one that we're initiating today. And essentially, this is going to be the foundation for many of the other projects. We've also started recording some podcasts with external stakeholders for our Caribbean connections and internal stakeholders, members of the coalition for our member spotlight. And soon our podcasts and other activities will be on our YouTube channel. We're hoping to launch that and our website by the end of March, God willing, hopefully on the 25th, which is the International Day for the Remembrance of Victims of the Slave Trade and Slavery. Contacting us is still the same, secretariat at CCA Tip. This is our website address, as I mentioned, which will be launched, well, 1 month from now, the 25th. Okay, that gives you a little sense of where we've been. If you've just joined, please complete the poll that's on the screen. So Charisse, at this time, I think I will be handing over to you. And this is, of course, to give us an overview of the stakeholder mapping project and then taking us through some of the questions. Over to you, Charisse.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Adrian. Could everyone or someone please let me know when you can see the slides?
We're able to see.
Perfect. So thank you so much for those of you who have joined. This will be pretty informal because it's a small group of us and all of you know me in some capacity, so we'll be able to move through a lot quicker. But this is the first consultation and the first step really for our stakeholder mapping exercise. And for me, this project is actually really timely. It is, I would say, a response to some of the needs that we've had in the region for a while, but also some questions that I recognized as I was working as a practitioner in the region. So a few of you would know, and those of you who didn't know would have heard that I joined anti-trafficking work in the capacity of judicial research assistant to the trafficking in persons judge in Belize. And while I was working with her, one of the things that I couldn't figure out was who's who in the Caribbean anti-trafficking field and even in Belize. It was really hard for me to get a grasp on who was doing what, when, and where. So I started doing things like creating maps. So for example, the one on the screen is a map I would have created of the flows in Belize and their anti-trafficking stakeholders. Now, some of the group are broader than others, and this was a first draft. This has gotten much more complex, but it was a way for me to see who worked where, how information flowed, and to be able to know where I needed to grab people. And that was where this project started, or where the first iteration of it was. Then throughout my PhD, it was again a problem that I recognized. We had a lot of people working in anti-trafficking in the region, but either people were not staying consistently, it was that we weren't sure exactly what people were working on, and we weren't sure how they were working or who they were partnering with. So this project, this mapping database, is envisioned to help cut down some of those challenges and to help us work more smoothly. And I think it's actually super timely. Before I joined the call, I was on LinkedIn, as I often am, and I saw a post from somebody that said, we need to stop doing needs assessments and we need to instead start doing mappings or mapping of assets to see what's actually working and where and how we can increase or exponentially grow the use of those resources. And especially now, as in the region, we are starting to think about what might be the shakeouts of what's happening in other spaces or other parts of the world. I think it's crucial that we know who is working on what, in what spaces, and how can we tap into those networks, or how can we come together, which is one of the mandates of the coalition. So that is what this project will be about. The rationale for it is, again, coming from some of the lack of data, anecdotal evidence, and also some research-based evidence that we have seen in the region as individual members of the stakeholder of the committee, but also things that I've seen in my own work and research. So we want to avoid duplication of efforts. A lot of times, different people are trying to do similar things and are using multiple pots of resources to do it individually when we could probably collaborate and see a greater result. We want to identify gaps. So where there are service gaps, where there are things that can need to be addressed, but we aren't seeing it because we're assuming that people are working on spaces. We want to be able to track progress. So one of the main challenges in the Caribbean anti-trafficking field is that we have not been tracking or successes or progress adequately. We still are not, we're often saying anecdotally what we've seen, but when it goes into measuring or metrics, we can't track that year on year. So we're trying to hopefully do that, and also to be able to see new entrants into the anti-trafficking space in the region, or people or organizations who are filtering out, so that we can know whether that's because a particular community has been served adequately, or it's because focus has shifted, or is it a matter of funding priorities. So we're trying to gather that information within this mapping, or at least have some data to be able to make certain inferences. And it's also a way to facilitate rapid response within the anti-trafficking stakeholder. So if something is happening in one country, we're seeing a trend in a particular Caribbean country, who is it that can be collaborated with quickly to respond to that in some other Caribbean country, or who can we benchmark from? And a really practical example, when I was working in Belize at the time, the judge that I was working for had not yet handled a trafficking case. So we needed to think about, for example, how could we write directions to our jury? What would that look like? What would those instructions look like? And we weren't sure where to look. But because of my legal background, I was able to say to the judge, well, here are the jurisdictions I think might have something. And I was able to look to the Jamaica bench book to see what they had written on jury directions and work on that. So that's the kind of networking or facilitation of cross-border work that we hope to facilitate with this database. So the objectives are identify, document, and map key stakeholders, foster collaboration, streamline information, so it's all in one place, and support policymaking and better resource allocation. One of the things that I've identified, and other members of the steering committee as well, is that oftentimes funding goes to the same countries, or funding goes to the same spaces. Whether or not that's where we actually see the need is a question that's yet to be answered. So how is it that we can provide something that says, with evidence, yes, this is where we need to focus, or not, or how is it that we can have information in one space rather than competing. Oftentimes, and when I was going through my research process, I would have recognized that I had to go to 12 different sources to try to figure out what was happening within the Caribbean. So that is one of the efforts that this project is hoping to build on. In terms of the reach, we are trying to go for the Anglophone Caribbean, so the English-speaking Caribbean, essentially the CARICOM countries. That was one of the easiest ways that we felt we could start with a manageable group and a group that was comparable, but also would have some things in common or some differentiations that we could build upon. The way that the process will work is that, especially if we look at the call, there are certain countries that have been and will be more responsive in terms of providing information. So we will pilot with those countries first and build out eventually or hopefully to have a database for the entire Anglophone Caribbean. And we hope to be categorizing and assessing according to geographical area of focus. So whether that's a specific part in a specific country or specific countries that a project is focusing on, for example. Field of expertise, so essentially which P are you focusing on and how are you focusing on that P? What services do you provide within those Ps, arguably? What is your resourcing looking like? So is it that you are needing additional funding, like most of us are, or is it that you need assistance with personnel, or is it that you're trying to provide training to your people for your project and you're not sure where to turn to get some of that training and capacity building? Is there somebody working in the region that can help with that? And we know that there's a need for that because oftentimes myself and other colleagues will receive emails from people within our networks to say, hey, do you know anybody who can train on this topic who's from the Caribbean? So we're trying to make it so that we don't have to be trying to pull information in a scramble. The database will allow you to access it and be able to check that for yourself. We're also trying to map the networks that have already happened. So what are the existing collaborations with other actors in the field that have worked really well? So Oliver is here from IOM Guyana. IOM Guyana did a wonderful job working with the Guyana Counter Trafficking grouping in order to provide, for example, SOPs or standard operating procedures for them. And even in reworking Guyana's legislation, which I think is perhaps most progressive in the Caribbean now. So thinking through those collaborations, how they have worked, why they have worked successfully, seeing how we can build upon them, or is it that we can benchmark from them? That's what we're trying to look at. And like any project, there are phases to it. So the first one is needs assessment, which we're no longer calling needs assessment after today, but that's essentially what we're doing here now. Informing stakeholders of what we're doing and discussing with stakeholders. Even though there's a research methodology that has been set out by myself and other members of the team, we want to work with you because you're the people on the ground to see what you want to see from the database and how it can be more helpful. Then after doing the consultation and gathering initial information from stakeholders as well, we'll think about designing the database. Where is it? How is it going to look? How is it going to work? Then we'll do some launching and some training on use of the database. And of course, maintenance and expansion will be ongoing for as long as possible because we'll have to be responding to your needs and to the things that you're seeing around you as well. So then here's how you contribute. Well, you've attended here today, so thank you so much for that. There are 3 scoping questions that I'll ask in the meeting shortly after this. The next thing we'll ask from you is that you complete our survey or our poll. Adrian has already posted it in the chat and posted it at the end of the agenda as well. So we'd really appreciate you completing that within the next 2 weeks so that I can start analyzing and building on that information. Highlighting other stakeholders who you think we should contact. You can do that by emailing me or emailing Adrian. Who are some other people you think that need to feed into this stakeholder mapping? And then there might potentially be some follow-up meetings. If there's something we need to clarify or we think there's more information that you can give or draw into the project or the space. One of the things I wanted to flag is that we're not saying that this is the first mapping that has occurred. I know IOM had done some mapping in, I believe it was 2005. I know that in each of the countries, there's some efforts to try to map what is happening within those countries as well. So we'd appreciate if you have any of that information, have any of that knowledge as to what would have come before, if you could also give us that information so we can build up a timeline or space as to what was happening. Essentially, I'm looking for as much information as you as stakeholders are willing to give. And as we go through this process, of course, I'm more than happy for if you've got any questions, if you need any contacts, if you need anything that you think we could offer as we're going through this process, I'm more than happy to work with you on that as well. So here are the 3 scoping questions. These are the 3 questions that I have set to get those of you in the room talking today. And I actually want to start with the final question, because I want to know from you as stakeholders, what would you like to see in a regional stakeholder mapping database? Apart from the things I've set out, what would you like to see? What do you think would be useful? So anybody, feel free to unmute or feel free to put it in the chat. This is your time to give us some feedback.
Good afternoon, all. So I came in a little bit late. I think I missed the introduction. So I just want to first introduce myself, Diana Shaw, from the Child Development Foundation here in Belize. I am also a legal consultant. I specialize in migration, human trafficking work, gender-based violence. I think what I want to see, and let me say hello, I see some of my colleagues there. Oliver, good to see you online. I see Colleen from Jamaica, and of course, hello to you as well, Cherise. Glad to see you working on this. I think for me, what I want to see from the regional mapping process now is one, or primarily a response to who are the persons or the players who are active now, and what the response will be from CSOs in the region, given the stop order from the US, which has affected a lot of our countries, and the shift in the response from the US in support of migration. I think that the region needs to now address its own challenges almost independently of the US. There is going to have to be a space where we are figuring out how to respond without the resources. Some of the resources will come back, but not all of it. And we will need to figure out how to go forward and still be able to respond robustly in terms of border management, but much more in terms of victim support, because that's the area that's going to be the hardest hit. So that's what I want to see, what's coming from the region. This side for Belize, a lot of our survivors are coming from Latin America, and ECPAT is also doing something similar in Latin America now, trying to identify the CSO players on the ground and to see what support will be needed to help the regional integration of CSOs respond to the challenges that will occur for migrants as a result of some of the things that are happening internationally. But I think it's also going to be important for us, Belize, for our Caribbean neighbors, because we're also going to be seeing some movement of persons in response to some of the things that are happening. It's going to change some of the migration trajectory. So we are likely to see persons coming, or there's talk of movement of persons who may be deported and who may try to leave their countries and now become vulnerable to trafficking, and how that is going to affect the trafficking profiles and of persons who are moving. So those are some of the things we're looking to see. What the trafficking profile will look like, how the changes internationally will affect this, what support is available to survivors on the ground from their home countries or other countries for resettlement, reintegration, and then how the Caribbean as a region is looking at the legal issues that need to be addressed. We are hearing now of talk of possibly countries being asked to house people from other countries that are not their nationals, how that will affect the rights of persons, and some of those things I think would be important for CSOs to figure out our position on those.
Thank you so much for that, Diana. Really interesting points raised there, especially the thinking about the response with less or no US resources. And I think what you said is interesting about us figuring it out on our own. And I definitely think that having this mapping exercise will allow us to do that and build those collaborations and foster that cross-country, but even inter-country response. So thank you for that. Anybody else?
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, Neil, go ahead.
Yes, very interesting presentation. For me, in terms of the regional mapping in Guyana, why you say, as you say, you had a good relationship with the counter trafficking unit and so on. But we have NGOs also work in the area of trafficking in person. And recently, one of the progressive NGO made some comment regarding the rescuing of victims in terms of the trials and tribulations they have go through, which is contrary to what the countering traffic unit does, right? And if you try to engage them here in Guyana in terms of coming to the table to sit down or participating at the level of the task force in terms of, area grievance and so on, it's not happening. So maybe what the regional mapping can also take into consideration is that, like a country in Guyana where you have NGOs and you have the task force and so not seeing eye to eye, if they can take a leadership role to bring them to, on one table so that at least at the end of the day, good collaboration will take place between them. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Neil. And I think having worked in several of the Caribbean countries now in this field, that's often the case where some NGOs and the government sector don't necessarily work together. And what I've seen a lot of times is that in some instances, that's simply been a case of misunderstanding, people not wanting to step on other people's toes or feeling as though they've been stepping on other people's toes. So I think the mapping exercise will be a clear and tangible laying out of what people are doing so that it can help to foster that understanding, which oftentimes is not there, but also to show how the collaboration can happen across state and non-state, because a lot of times, especially if going back to that diagram I had on the first screen, a lot of international funders are not going to come into a country unless there is government buy-in. So even for the NGOs to get funding from international agencies, there has to be some acknowledgement of the government stakeholders of how that will work as well, or at least some knowledge of the government knowing what's happening and how that's proceeding. So I definitely think it's important for people to be around the table or at least know what's going on. So thank you for that. Anybody else? So we've had Guyana and Belize speaking so far. Anybody from those same countries or just across the region as well? Nobody's brave enough. Okay, so then if you don't want to tack onto that question, or if you're still thinking, in addition to that question, I would say do you have knowledge of any mappings happening within your country or the spaces that you work in at the moment? That might be an easier question to answer as well. You can also feel free to pop anything in the chat, or it's really open. This space is for you as stakeholders to give us. If you're taking time to think, you can also take this time to fill in the poll that Adrian would have put in the chat and on the agenda, because that will have similar questions. If you didn't feel as though you wanted to verbally contribute, filling in that poll will give us answers to the data that we are seeking as well.
Reese, I know someone has already started. You've received one submission already. So people are working behind the scenes. In response to your question, I
Amazing.
remember we were reaching out before this consultation to different stakeholders, and someone mentioned UNFPA had done some stakeholder mapping on gender-based violence as well as on trafficking in persons for Guyana. So I'm not sure if there's anyone from UNFPA on the call or somebody from Guyana who's aware of that particular mapping exercise. It'd be great if they could just share what they're aware of from that.
If I can jump in. Hi again.
Of course you can, Oliver. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Happy to. Yeah, so yeah, I'm aware of the GBV mapping. I'm not sure. I think we actually were trying to do a trafficking in persons mapping in Guyana. It didn't get off the ground. But the GBV one, we actually were going to use that as what more or less a model, just to kind of copy the progress that was made there. And while I'm here, I just wanted to mention as well, whatever I was going to say, or I'm going to say, I think Charisse already mentioned that is going to be covered. But I can mention that, yeah, we are looking forward to seeing the civil society component that Neil brought up, because we have worked with a lot of civil society organizations in Guyana, but some of our country offices elsewhere, when we work with them on trafficking in persons project proposals and so on, sometimes there's not that much of collaboration with civil society, so we don't know of much of the civil society component that, or complement that is in the other countries in the Caribbean. So it'd be cool for us to also see those other partners are there. And also the resources you mentioned as well, Charisse, the knowledge of who does what, who can train on this subject, and also who has done what. You mentioned earlier IRM Guyana doing that SOPs for the government of Guyana. Well, Diana Shaw, who spoke earlier, she's the one who was the consultant there. So to know that, to know who is who, and to see what kind of who we can tap into for the skill, that would be pretty cool, instead of starting fresh every time there's a new undertaking. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Oliver. And I agree with you, because one of the things that was hardest for me as a researcher and is frustrating when trying to find information is that sometimes the projects might be funded only for a few years. And once they're done, you don't know who did them, what the length of time was, or anything of the sort. So that I'm hoping that the database will be able to provide that timeline as well. So let's say even any of you have projects that you might be coming to the end of, or let's say there was an idea, and again, if it's not something that has happened fully, you wouldn't have to give detail. But if there's something that you were even aspiring to do, maybe we could have a section for that to see if there's a way that you could get collaborators on it, or we could know what has happened and when it would have ended, so that we can build from there. Because I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, Oliver, but some of the funding for that SOPs had come under the Western Hemisphere project, and that was coming to an end at some point. So it was about whether what would then happen from there. But even things like that are interesting to know, where the funding has come from before, what has been done, and what the timeline on it would have been. Anybody else that wants to jump in?
I want to also say that it may also require us to have a little bit of a wider lens. I know, especially from the government side and different consultations and projects that I've worked with, where I've worked with different governments in the Caribbean, it's the move or the thinking is that trafficking issues need to be integrated more, because it's hard if without US funding to have separate budgets just for trafficking work. Usually the staff that work trafficking cases are also doing other work. Social workers are doing other work on child protection, other issues. The court system here, Belize had done, as you were aware when you were here, a model. We were trying to do a pilot to do a model sexual offenses court. That still hasn't gone off the ground yet because the government just hasn't found the resources to be able to do a standalone court just for that. So I think we also have to think about an integrated approach. I know I will share with you the results of a mapping that I did for the CCJ on the gender-based violence response, because there may be a need to properly sit trafficking within the wider gender-based violence response in the Caribbean, as there will be funding that will still continue for some of that work. So in terms of where we find resources and the next step, it will be helpful for CSOs working in this field to build those collaborations, not just within the trafficking sector, but where the intersectionalities arise and where we can work with other responses, the wider GBV response, the child protection response, while still ensuring that there is the proper focus on trafficking. I know that there was advocacy to separate it years ago because we needed to have a more stronger focus and to ensure that the needs were being prioritized. But in the reality where resources are limited and governments are looking to see how far the budgets can stretch, this is something that we also need to look at as the CSO agencies.
Thank you for that, Diana. It's a super interesting point, but also a point that is borne out in evidence. So within or when I was doing my mapping of 3 countries that I was doing, there's not that many CSOs or government entities, apart from the task force or the councils, depending on the name in the country, that are focused only on trafficking. In most countries, the police are combined. So they might be focusing on sex crimes and trafficking, or something else and trafficking. If you look at the organizations, so CSOs, NGOs on the ground, they might be involved in trafficking or anti-trafficking work as a tangent. So for example, Seroptimus is not a trafficking organization, but a lot of women rights organizations, a lot of domestic violence organizations, a lot of migration organizations, children's rights organizations, religious organizations even have integrated trafficking within their streams. So again, for this stakeholder mapping exercise, those are the things we want to know, and those are the people we want to have contact with if you have those contacts as well. Because if I Google anti-trafficking, a lot of those organizations probably won't come up. So those are the people who are working that we want to know about from you as well. So that's a really, really helpful point there, Diana, as well. Anybody else? And I'm focusing on this question because the other 2 you will be answering as a part of that poll. But I really want to know how this database can serve the community, because there's no point doing it if it's not going to be fit for purpose. So anybody else want to jump in, tell me how you think it will be, what would be useful, what you don't want to see again, those kinds of things.
Hi guys, this is Shamir. I have been in and out, but I don't know if someone said this before, but I definitely want to include this to have survivor leaders as a part of the conversation. And when we're talking about survivor leaders, it could be independent survivor leaders and survivor-led organizations to be a part of our stakeholders.
Thank you for that, Shamir. And I want to ask you a question on that as you were here. How do you think we can go about reaching survivor leaders? Because my experience has been that a lot of the survivors in the Caribbean are at different points in their journey. And I know you've said this before, so they might not necessarily be willing to contribute or share their stories in that way. But I agree with you that survivors are such an important stakeholder. So how do you think we can meaningfully engage survivors in something like this mapping?
That's a great question, Charisse. Well, it first starts with seeing survivors as more than their stories and having far more to contribute to this movement than their stories, right? And so when we look at let's say project development, survivors could come in and advise on that project development through their lived experience, not necessarily sharing their story to say, this happened to me, but understanding the scope of trafficking and whatever project development it is to advise on, hey, this can work better if we look at it through this end. I can give you a basic example, like for me, which was like my haha moment. Like sometimes I do sting operations with law enforcement, right? Where I'm working with an undercover officer trying to talk to a minor online. And I would have to say to the officer, no, you can't say that. Like you sound like an adult saying that. That's not the language we use. Like you got to use a different, right? So understanding how survivors and whether it doesn't matter what stage they're on in their healing, because I believe, and actually it does matter, if they're still receiving services, if they're still in like they just came out of they just exited their situation and they're still receiving that critical care, I don't believe that we should be involving those survivors, because I do believe that they need to focus on their healing, like getting out of the situation and getting settled. But survivors who've been, out of services for at least 2 years, right? And in a place where they're ready to give back, right? I don't believe, because everybody's on a different level of healing when it comes to on that spectrum, right? So it doesn't matter if they've been doing this for 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. Everybody has to start from somewhere, right? So the question is, are you ready? Are you willing to work on this project? And if they are, how can we find a place to include them? Right? So whether that is reviewing material, like for me as a survivor leader that's been doing this work for 14 years, I've worked on so many different pieces without sharing my story. So whether that is policy on a federal and state level in the Caribbean, in other countries, training, across the board, right? So it's just, how do you take your lived experience, understand of someone who's, actually lived a life of being trafficked, and how can we take that experience not just from your own, but from hearing from other survivor leaders. In terms of where we find these, of course, I just started the Caribbean Survivor Network, so there access there, and we're growing, expanding that, because there are so many other survivors that I know around the world that want to give back in some capacity. Some have direct connection to the Caribbean, some don't, but it's just a matter of asking. And I know specifically for the Caribbean Survivor Network, what we have said is that you have to actually be born in the Caribbean or be a first generation Caribbean descent to be a part of our network. So, we have that direct connection there, but it's asking. I know I've met survivors even through doing work on the UN level. They're like, hey, I have done work in the Caribbean, or I have this Caribbean connection, and I would never know if I wasn't engaging with them like that, so it's just a matter of asking and reaching out to other survivors to say, who do you know? And this is the profile of a survivor leader that we're looking for, right? So like our work is directly for the Caribbean, so we wouldn't want, a European survivor coming in telling us what to do in the Caribbean. We want that direct link. And sorry, guys, I'm just a straight talker, so I'm just going to say yes. We're not going to want a European survivor coming in telling us what to do in the Caribbean. We have our own Caribbean survivors that can tell us that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And so giving a plug, because we work across communities in the coalition, if anybody is aware of any survivors or wants to know more about survivor leaders, please do contact Shamir. I'm sure she would be more than happy to have those contacts or those conversations. Shamir, correct me if I'm wrong. I can see that somebody just joined because the number went up, but I can't see who just joined the conversation. So maybe Adrian, if you could let me know, but thank you to whoever the person is that just came in a few minutes ago. Anybody else wants to share on this question of what you want to see from this regional stakeholder mapping database? I'm still open. Is there anything that you specifically would not want to see that you feel has been done? How do you think we can make it sustainable and responsive for the community?
I had my hand up.
Yes, Diana's hand is up, and I just wanted to announce that it was Joycelyn Hughes, Miss Joycelyn Hughes from CARICOM Impacts, who has just joined us. Good afternoon, Joycelyn.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, Joycelyn. So Diana will go to you, and then we will let Joycelyn join the conversation if that's something she would like to do.
Awesome. No, I was actually going to comment in response to Shamir and hoping that Shamir will share her information in the chat. We would want to get in touch with her. We have been wanting to do survivors networks because we have worked with a lot of survivors over the years. The CSO organization that I lead has been doing this work in Belize for 19 years. Our challenge has been, though, that Belize is a very small, interconnected society, and survivors are very unwilling to do anything in the public sphere. Some of their families, they don't want to face pushback from the public or even from family members in being public, even though they may have been in recovery and have completed rehabilitation for several years. They still don't want to join those networks. We have asked some of them, they're not interested in doing that. They will share information in private research or it's one-on-one, but they don't want to be upfront to be advocates because the society is very insular and there is usually a lot of victim blaming on social media when people step forward to do things like that. So I would want to hear some more about how they help survivors to navigate that. But then she kind of answered it because she mentioned, I think they're based in the US and they're working with survivors who are not necessarily still living in the communities where they were trafficked or in the countries where they were trafficked. So they're still living there.
So, Diane, for the Caribbean Survivor Network, you have some survivors that live in the US and some actually still live in their countries.
Yeah, that's the challenge we're having, how to get them, because it is a challenge. We have had people that have been threatened, so we don't want to put anybody in any kind of situation where they'll be uncomfortable. But we do encourage them to participate in national mechanisms. When policies are being developed, we try to create safe spaces for them to give input. And they do participate internally in our development of projects for our organization, but they could contribute more if they felt safer in response to the national response and being able to guide some of those things. I think that would be good. The other challenge that we have, also some of the survivors go back to their home country, because when we have migrants, 99% of them want to go back home. They don't want to relocate to stay in Belize. And when they go back home, it's very difficult to get them to participate, even in court proceedings, because we're having challenges with that right now, even though we have changed laws to allow for remote evidence. They still don't want to participate because once they go back home, they start a new life. Many of them don't share anything with their family about what happened to them here or what, so they don't want to dredge that up. They don't want to talk about it or to be a part of that. So a lot of those that have been migrants, which for Belize is a high percentage of our survivors, don't want to participate in anything that will have them be identified or where, even if their identity is going to be masked. I know IOM was trying to get some of them last year when they were trying to map survivors' voices to participate, and all of them refused, even though they had been back in their country for several years. So it's
Diana,
very difficult.
Sorry, I was going to say Shamir has put her email address in the chat. So maybe
yes,
you can continue to engage with her online on this. And
yes,
of course,
I will definitely reaching out to you, Shamir.
Perfect. So Ms. Joycelyn Hughes has joined us. Joycelyn, did you want to add to the conversation? We're just having a discussion. I'm very mindful that we're on the hour now, but I would like to hear from you. We're talking about getting the stakeholder mapping database and exercise up. What do you think would be useful to have within this database?
Unfortunately, Joycelyn just dropped off. I'm not sure
Okay,
if she's
that's
having
fine.
technical challenges or so. I'm not
That's
sure if
okay.
anyone else would like to weigh in before we close off.
Yes. No? Well, in any case, I'm very mindful of time and I'm really, really grateful for all of you for coming. So what I would ask of you is to please fill the poll that Adrian has provided in the chat and on the agenda. Please do contact me if there's any questions that come up after, or if you can think about any other stakeholders that we need to engage. We will be coming to you periodically just to let you know what's happening with the database, or so that Adrian can let you when we get our YouTube up and running, our website, there will be updates there as to how things are progressing. So I'm really grateful for all of you for coming. Really happy to see all of you again, those of you who would have known me in different spaces. And thank you so much for joining us. Somebody just added something in the chat that I cannot see. So let me stop sharing and go to the chat. Oh, it was Adrian. Perfect.
Yes, just
So
put
thank
the
you to
link to the
everyone.
form again.
Yes, have a wonderful evening. Well, it's night for me now, but have a wonderful evening, and I hope I'll speak to all of you again soon. If there are any questions, you can let me know, and I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you for organizing this. We will definitely be in touch. If there's anything else you need from us, Cherise, just email me if you need additional information when you have reviewed our submission.
Will
And
do.
Cherise,
Thank
maybe
you
you
so
can
much.
put
Yes,
your
please.
email address in the chat as well so that people can reach out.
Sure, I will. I just noticed that there's an Alex on the chat who I am
Alex
not acquainted with.
Ramnath.
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Ramnath, would you like to introduce yourself? I know you probably came in while we were having the discussion. We're asking everyone to just give a brief introduction. Ms. Gordon, Kamisha, I'm not sure if you'd be able to unmute and just give a brief introduction as well.
Okay. It doesn't seem like those persons are with us or would be able to hear us. So in any case, Adrian, if you have contact information, please feel free to let them contact me, or we can get discussions going in some other way.
Thanks so much, Cherise. Thanks to each and every one of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And we will continue to keep in touch. Our next newsletter for the coalition will go out in March, and we have a bi-monthly newsletter that we would normally do for Free the Slaves Caribbean that will be out before the end of this week. Yeah, so I'll give you a little update on some of the things that we're working on in terms of movement building, and the newsletter next month will give a lot more information about some of the member spotlight videos that we've done, the Caribbean Connections videos. So if you're an organization within the Caribbean and you're doing anti-trafficking work, just reach out. We're just having brief informal chats with people for about 30 minutes max, about some of the work that you're doing, how that ties into addressing trafficking at a regional level. And also some of the areas where you may be looking for organizations to partner or to donate in some project that you may be working on at present, and just getting the word out and seeing how we can connect the Caribbean in that manner. Okay. All right. So thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. And you, Cherise, a lovely evening. And we'll connect again. Bye-bye.